Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is energy storage for winter grid reliance, reliability, how batteries became the low-cost solution for power assurance in Massachusetts. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group, and we have guest speakers with us today from Applied Economics Clinic. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees today are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of our webinar today. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect via computer, mic, and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled on your screen here. And you can also click on the arrow to expand your webinar console. And one thing that you might like to do with your webinar console during the webinar is to type in your questions and your comments into the questions panel. We're going to save about 15 minutes or so for a Q&A with our panelists following their presentations, and we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can. A final note, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send you an email with a link to the webinar recording, as well as a PDF of all of the slides, probably this afternoon or tomorrow at the latest. And we'll also post all of those materials on our website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. And that's a good URL to know because it's also where we post information about all of our upcoming webinars, as well as all of our webinar archives. So with that, I'd like to now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Todd Alinsky-Paul. Todd is a Senior Project Director here at Clean Energy Group, and he is going to get us started.
Thanks, Samantha. Welcome to the webinar, everyone. This is another in our series of webinars. Clean Energy Group and Clean Energy States Alliance puts on a lot of these every month. There's at least one and sometimes more, often more. So I'll do a brief intro and then I will pass the baton to our presenters for today. I just want to let everyone know that, as Samantha said, the webinar is being recorded. All the recorded webinars from the past years are archived on our website and available for viewing at any time. So Clean Energy Group is a nonprofit. We're located in Vermont. You can see a number of our foundation supporters on the slide here. And Samantha, if you could just advance the slide, please. The particular report that we are introducing today is part of our efforts to help states to develop energy storage policy and programs and regulation. And so we've done a lot of work in this area, and a lot of it in New England. And I'll show you in a minute some of the previous reports that are sort of leading up to this one that you might find of interest. But basically, we try to support state energy storage policy and program development with independent analysis, such as what we are going to be presenting today, reports, webinars, conference presentations, etc. We provide direct policy and program development support to individual states on an as-needed basis. We also have a state energy storage working group, which is convened by CESA, which meets regularly. And if you are in the audience and you're a state policy person at a state agency and you're interested in learning more about energy storage and what other states are doing, you're a member of CESA, you're welcome to join that group. And finally, we collaborate with many partners, including national laboratories, DOE, state energy agencies, industry, utilities, and so forth. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that we've done a lot of work, and there are a number of reports leading up to this one. Reading from backwards, from right to left here. 2 years ago now, we put out our sort of initial report having to do with energy storage as an efficiency measure. And it was titled Energy Storage, the New Efficiency. And this was followed up by a series of reports on the Connected Solutions Program in Massachusetts, which is in fact what Massachusetts calls the portion of the efficiency program that includes storage and other behind-the-meter demand-reducing measures. And so the green report is an economics report on connected solutions as it applies to multifamily affordable housing. The purple one is an energy storage policy report dealing with connected solutions as a policy model for states to adopt. The dark blue report, which came out earlier this year, is an assessment of the Connected Solutions program as it's been administered in Massachusetts over its initial couple of years. And that was done in collaboration with the Applied Economics Clinic. And the final one on the far left here is the one we're presenting today, Energy Storage for Winter Grid Reliability. This topic is very much connected with programs like Connected Solutions, because these programs provide performance payments to customers, to electric customers in the state who install a battery behind their meter and then essentially sell battery services back to the utility. And the main battery service that's sold to the utility in most areas where this kind of virtual power plant has been developed is peak demand reduction, or supplying peak capacity, which amounts to pretty much the same thing. And so these customers are compensated based on how much peak load they reduce or capacity they provide to the grid when the utilities call upon their behind-the-meter batteries to do so. The rates they are paid are based on calculations of what peak capacity is worth. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. In New England, peak capacity is the subject of a 3-year forward auction that the ISO holds, ISO New England. And based on auction prices and other things, the ISO sets capacity rates, but it's all based on summer capacity because we're a summer peaking region. We have known for a long time that winter capacity was also very important, necessary to prevent blackouts in the winter. And for several reasons, we believe it's going to become even more important and more valuable. The problem is that there hasn't been a real dollar value set on that. And I'll let our presenters explain why that is and how the new report that they've written and we're promoting and we are collaborating on explains a little bit about how winter reliability, as it's called, services should be valued, and how that reflects on the performance payment rates for these programs. So, Samantha, if you could advance the slide, please. And all of these reports are, of course, available for free on our website, and you can download them at any time. And you see there the URL for doing that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just introduce our speakers now, and then I will turn this over to them for the actual substance of the webinar. Liz Stanton, Director and Senior Economist at Applied Economics Clinic, and Joshua Castigliego, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Joshua, if I didn't, please correct me. Researcher at the Applied Economics Clinic. And we've worked, Clean Energy Group and AEC have worked together now on a number of analysis efforts and reports. And we're very happy to be able to present this webinar to promote this latest effort. So if you could just go ahead and advance the slide. I think that's it for me. And I will mute myself and allow our speakers to take over. And by the way, please do type in your questions into the question panel as they occur to you. And that'll help us get to as many as we can at the end.
Thanks, Todd. Can everybody hear me? Or can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. This is Liz Stanton. I'm the Director and Senior Economist at the Applied Economics Clinic. And we're a nonprofit consulting group based in Massachusetts. Yeah, just keep on that first slide there. Thank you. And we work on issues of energy, climate, the environment, and equity. And I appreciate that great introduction to this piece of work, Todd, and we're gonna dive on in here. Josh, do you have control over the slides?
Yeah.
Just confirming, you do? Great, okay. So flip us over to the next slide. Great, so this is just a quick outline to let you know where we're headed. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the avoided cost of electric capacity, just to get everybody oriented to what we're trying to observe and measure here. We'll talk about what is winter reliability and does it have a monetary value? And from there, we'll go on to some policy recommendations and also some important areas that are needed for research going forward. Go ahead. Great. So we've got at latest count, 104 people on the call, and I'm sure that everyone is at different places with their understanding of the electric sector. So forgive me if I'm talking about things that you already know. When we pay our electric bills, we're paying not just for energy, for how much we use kilowatt hour by kilowatt hour, we're also paying for something called electric capacity. And the electric capacity is, put simply, what we pay generators to stand ready to provide our electricity when we need it. We'll go to the next slide to give you a little bit more information. So we don't use the same amount of electricity in every hour of the year. The top graph on this slide is showing what a peak day, a day where we use the most electricity is, one day in summer and one day in winter. And the bottom is showing peaks across the year to give you an idea that there's a lot of variation in how much energy is used in every hour and in every day. The most energy is used on a summer day, sometime in the late afternoon, as you can see in the light blue line. And we, as a grid for the New England area, need to have available to us not only that peak amount, the most energy that we're going to use or expected to use in a year, but also a reliability reserve above that. So if anything goes wrong with any of the generators or other resources that we're relying on, we need to have an extra portion just to account for that so that there aren't any blackouts. And that top dotted line, the reliability requirement, that's the amount of electric supply, electric capacity that we need to have standing ready to provide our needs, even though on a fall day at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, or 5 o'clock in the morning, excuse me, we need much, much less than that to meet our needs in that moment. Just looking at this slide for one more moment, Todd had mentioned that there's a difference in how summer and winter peak, that capacity on those peaks is being valued in Massachusetts. For the summer peak, we have a market. There is an auction that is the capacity auction or the forward capacity market, and generators and other kinds of services that are able to supply peak. So that could be battery, that could be demand response, where we're organizing various kinds of customers to reduce their demand in a moment of high demand. That those kinds of resources that can supply peak are bidding into the market, offering their services, and the ones that offer the lower prices are passing through the market and taking on the obligation of supplying capacity when it's needed for a price. Based on that price, the clearing price of that market, that's how Massachusetts utilities are valuing summer peak for energy efficiency programs, what the value that is placed on that in determining the worth of those programs, and also more recently in how they're valuing battery storage programs. that are also run by the utilities. In contrast, winter peak, in those same kinds of evaluations for programs, is being valued at $0 per hour. So summer peak is getting the clearing price. The clearing price in the last auction was something like $31 a kilowatt year, and winter peak is getting 0. Go ahead to the next slide. This is just a slide to help people see the idea of how batteries work and how they're valuable on peak. So this is a graph showing demand over the course of a day, where demand is second highest in the morning when everybody's getting ready to go to school and work, and highest in the evening when people are returning home and turning on lights, turning on appliances, and so on. Those times, those peak times, the highest times of demand, are what costs the most to run on our grid system. They're the most expensive part of running the electric grid. So whenever we can shave off those peaks and find a way to serve those needs at a different time of the day, flattening out the entire demand curve and reducing the total amount of capacity needed, we can save money for every customer on the electric system. Here, showing a battery, the idea is that if we charge up the batteries during a non-peak time, here we're showing that green time in the afternoon, we charge up our batteries then we can use that charge in peak times and rely on batteries instead of relying on more expensive generators. Okay. So that's the background portion. I'm sure people are having questions or will have questions. We're going to hold the questions for the end. It would be helpful if you're noting down questions as we go along to note down the slide number so that we can get back there and show you that slide again when we address your questions. And now I will turn it over to my colleague, Joshua.
Thanks, Liz. Okay, so winter capacity services are necessary to avoid blackouts during the coldest months of the year when gas supply for power generation is more constrained due to competing needs with heating. The value of this winter electric capacity is treated by electric distributors as distinct from the same value in summer. So it has been dubbed winter reliability to distinguish it from summer capacity. When calculating customer performance payments, such as those for battery storage, summer capacity services are valued, but winter reliability services are not. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the coming slides. So in essence, winter reliability is the assurance of adequate electric capacity during periods of critical need. In this presentation and in our report, we follow ISO New England's convention and refer to these periods of critical need as capacity scarcity conditions, denoted as CSC. When you see our measurement of the winter reliability value in the next few slides, you'll notice that we use a new metric, which is $1 per CSC kilowatt hour. This metric is meant to focus in on the value of providing peak capacity during these time periods. In terms of winter reliability, there are various peak management options in New England that can provide these services. These options can be grouped into 2 categories, as you can see here in this table. There are customer performance payments, as well as peak supply technologies. And we'll see a little bit more about those in the next few slides. So in this presentation, we'll show you that winter reliability does have a value, it does exist. However, this value, as Liz mentioned, is currently assumed to be 0 in cost-benefit analyses conducted by Massachusetts program administrators in their 3-year energy efficiency plans. In the previous energy efficiency plan for the years 2019 to 2021, program administrators agreed to conduct a study to quantify the benefits associated with providing winter reliability services. However, in the proposed plan for 2022 to 2024, the program administrators claim that there are no material benefits from winter demand reduction. Okay, so now we can kind of get into what is the value of winter reliability. So here you can see that gas peakers are currently the cheapest peak supply technology available to provide winter reliability services. It is important to understand the costs of these peak supply technologies because electric distributors use them as a benchmark when designing their customer performance payments. Before I move on to the next slide, I want to make sure that you're focusing in on the winter reliability value of gas peakers, which here you can see ranges from roughly $2 to $4 per CSC kilowatt hour. It'll become important in the next slide. So here you can see that there's that same value range for a gas peaker plant, the $2 to $4 for the gas peakers. And you can see that all current customer performance payments are either equal to or less than the cost of new gas peakers. They range from about 51 cents to like $2 to $3. However, as Liz will describe in the next slide, gas peakers are no longer or will no longer be a viable choice to provide winter reliability services in the future. And with that, I will pass it along to her to describe more about that.
Thanks, Josh. So up until now, let's go back to the previous slide for just 1 second. Up until now, utilities and the ISO and agencies have been determining what to pay in incentives for customer performance payments for things like supplying battery or EV charging or other things that can demand response, other things that can reduce peak load. They've decided on what the value should be for those payments based on the value of a gas peaker plant. And that's just straight out of economics. The idea is if you weren't doing one, you'd have to do the other. So if you weren't getting peak supply from these various customer programs, you would have to get it from that gas peaker plant. That's the lowest cost out of your supply or utility technologies. And so the providers of these programs are willing to pay up to the value of that gas peaker plant, but no more than that in order to get peak supply by using incentives, by using performance payments. They'll be willing to pay as much as a gas peaker, but not any more than that. However, going forward in Massachusetts, go on to the next slide, gas peakers are, over time, no longer an option. Adding new gas peakers is arguably not an option anymore, barring a few that are currently under development and permitting. Adding more and more gas peakers isn't an option for Massachusetts. Our statutes under the Global Warming Solution Act prevent that, as do other programs and goals of Massachusetts for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's a limit on new power plants. It's already been exceeded in Massachusetts if you include some permitted ones. And it's just not possible to continue to add more gas peakers. So in the absence of being able to get this peak supply from a gas peaker, it has to be gotten someplace else. Go to the next slide. So if we eliminate the gas peaker plant as the backup option that utilities and the ISO and so on are looking at when setting their incentives, we should look instead to the next least cost option. So if they can't get this peak supply from customers through performance payments, what can they get it from? Well, in the absence of gas peaker plant, which is becoming non-feasible because of emissions laws, in the absence of the gas peaker plant, the next cheapest technology on the supply side is battery storage at the utility scale. And based on the most recent prices that we looked at, you can get that for between $5 and $15. There's a lot of variation in that, and that's why it's such a big range. So that's a higher cost than the gas peaker plant. And our argument here is that to the extent that the utilities, the ISO, the agencies are setting performance payments on the basis of the cost of a gas peaker, if that is not an option to them, they should instead be setting performance payments on the basis of the next least cost option, circled in yellow here, which is the battery storage utility scale. And if they were to do that, it would greatly increase performance payments. Go ahead, Josh, next slide. So some policy recommendations based on that. Customer battery performance payments should be increased by at least 33%. That's a bare minimum. That gets you up to the high end of gas peaker costs. It does not get you up to even the low end of the utility scale battery storage. Second, the value of winter reliability services is greater than 0 and should be included at its true value in measurement of the benefits of programs including energy efficiency, demand response, batteries that are themselves determining how much incentive payments are going to be. In order to get the right incentive payment that includes the full benefit of these services, you have to include everything that's a benefit. And winter reliability is a benefit to the grid. And our main evidence for saying that it's a benefit to the grid is that we're observing the utilities, the ISO, the agencies paying for winter reliability. If they're paying for it, it has a value, and that value is greater than 0. Third recommendation, the time to make positive changes to battery program performance payments and budgets is now. With the current payments being less than the value that they should be, that means that the incentive is too low. It's not bringing in all of the customers willing to participate in these programs that it could be. And on the flip side, we, as all of the energy customers of the utility, are therefore paying too much on our bills because there's another option that the utilities could be paying for capacity that's lower cost. Next slide. A few things that we're noting here as things that are needed for further research and important areas of investigation. The first is setting a specific value of winter reliability services. That's not what we're doing here. We're demonstrating that there is a value on the basis of existing programs, setting a value for it to be used in energy efficiency programming and other programming run by the ISO or state agencies is a different task and a necessary one. Second, figuring out on that basis, what's the appropriate customer incentive levels? How much should we be offering to customers to make sure that we have these peak services and that we get as much of this lower cost peak service as we can instead of relying on higher cost gas peaker plants and utility scale batteries. Third, the most cost-effective scaled incentive program budgets, given their value and their cost. So how much of this should be offered? How much is enough of customer participation in these programs? This is analysis that's based on figuring out how much is out there and how much you would have to pay to get it, while staying under the price that peak services cost from gas peakers and going forward battery, utility scale batteries. Finally, consideration of what other programs and regulations may require adjustment as a result of updated winter reliability values. So this is an ongoing process. The answers to all of these questions change as we begin to implement or as we continue and dig deeper into implementing our global warming solution policies to achieve our emissions reduction goals. And as technologies change and prices on those technologies change, it's a constantly evolving area, and there's an opportunity here to be able to get peak supply that is both zero emission and lower cost than what might be available from other sources. So it's an area that needs further investigation and that has a very direct policy application in how these measures and incentives are being valued today. Next. And there you go. We thank you for listening to us on this, and we're really happy to take any questions. We know that's a complicated area, and we've glossed over some of the technical details to stay at a high level and give the big picture. But we're happy to dig in on any part of it. Todd?
Great. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation. We do have some very good questions. And just to lead up to this first question, I wanted to mention that there has been a concern in New England, and probably it is, I'm guessing, there may be similar concerns in other cold parts of the world, where increasingly natural gas is, in the winter, stretched a bit thin because of competing uses. You have gas being used for electric generation, and then you have gas being used for heating. And so gas as a heating fuel and gas as a generation fuel means that there's more competition for the gas during certain times of the year when people are heating spaces. So with that as background, the questioner wants to know, what are the fuel cost assumptions in ISO New England's estimate of the cost of gas peakers in the winter on cold nights when gas is most expensive, or were they using an average gas cost instead of the marginal price during periods of peak demand for gas?
Liz, you're muted.
Thank you. I said I'm going to guess that neither Josh or I know that one off the top of our heads. Each one of the different measures that you see in the report is based on its own set of complicated assumptions and calculations. And so that's something we could definitely look up for you, because we had to use that information to get to the results that we're presenting. But we don't have every assumption in the report on the fly, unfortunately. Josh, did you have anything to add?
No.
Okay. Somebody has asked whether the social cost of carbon is included in when the pay for performance rates are set. In other words, and I guess this goes partly to rate setting and partly to cost benefit analysis. Is or will pay for performance include the social cost of carbon when using fossil fuels?
I think the best answer is no, that it doesn't include that. And Josh, you can correct me if I'm wrong. There are some places and calculations that do consider greenhouse gas costs. So specifically for utility programs, for programming that is included in the Massachusetts Program Administrator's 3-year plan, there is consideration of greenhouse gas costs. I don't believe that's the case for the ISO New England programs and how they're setting it, but it's also true that we don't have 100% access to how those numbers are being calculated, and that we're making some inferences in figuring out the nuts and bolts. Now, on the utility side, in the 3-year plan, we can see those numbers a lot better and have a lot more detail. And so there is consideration for a social cost of carbon in the following way. It's not a social cost of carbon. It's a abatement cost of carbon, which is a little bit different. And it's been calculated looking at available zero emissions technologies in Massachusetts that can be applied on the grid, and what's available and how much of it is available, and then subtracting from that value what we pay in markets like RGGI. So it's a complicated calculation. It's being used, and the number that's proposed for it for the proposed 3-year plan is a whole lot higher than it was in the last or current 3-year plan. This value is being applied only to energy reduction and not to reductions that apply to peak. So it's just a generalized benefit over the year. We were going to have this much generation. Because of this measure, we're going to have less generation, and that means that we'll have less emissions and that much less on a dollar value because of that abatement cost. For something like battery storage, there isn't a generation reduction over the course of the year from that measure. And so there's no other place in the calculations that a difference in emissions caused by peak shaving would be valued. So that piece of it, emissions benefits that come from peak shaving, is not included in anybody's measure here. But for those kinds of measures that do have a generation reduction over the course of a year, that is being given a benefit in Massachusetts energy efficiency and other utility programming only.
Okay, thank you. Somebody is asking how exactly are performance payments used to meet peak demand, and this is something that I think I could speak to. It's a basic program design, and maybe we should have gone into that a little bit more to make that clear. So the Connected Solutions program in Massachusetts, and there are similar programs now operating in almost all the states in New England. There's the same thing going on in Rhode Island. Connecticut just started a 9-year program, very similar. Here in Vermont, we have Green Mountain Power doing similar programs with their customers. Basically, the way it works is that the utility offers customers a contract. It's a multi-year contract. And what the contract does is allows the utility to pay the customer for battery services and other kinds of behind-the-meter load reduction services. So some customers may enroll their thermostat, for example, into this kind of program. We're dealing here in this webinar with batteries in particular, although it could be a thermostat or an EV or something else. And so the way it works is the customer installs the battery. They could buy it or lease it. They install it in their home or their commercial facility. They sign a multi-year contract with their utility, their electric utility, saying for the next 5 years, I will enroll in this program. And the program essentially allows the utility to send a signal to all of these enrolled customers, letting them know this is a peak demand period. We're looking for peak demand load reductions or export of power from your behind-the-meter resource. If it's a battery, you could use it to export power, or you could use it to lower your facility load or your home load. And so rather than paying a peaker plant to come online and generate during those peak periods, the utility can actually call on its customers to lower their demand or to supply electricity from their behind-the-meter battery. And by aggregating thousands of these customers, utilities can effectually manage these peak demand events. And that saves a lot of money because the utilities pay, in New England, utilities pay ISO New England based on each utility's proportionate peak load during those regional peaks. So if the regional peak happens at 5 p.m. on a Saturday in August, and National Grid happens to be able to lower their demand during that peak by paying some of their customers to discharge batteries at that time, National Grid then, by doing that, lowers the amount of payments that they have to make to ISO New England for that capacity. And the same thing happens year-round. There are monthly peaks, and there is an annual peak. And those monthly peaks and annual peaks are used to calculate what all the utilities pay in order to compensate the ISO for what they're paying in turn to peakers. So that's kind of a simplified way of explaining it. And that's why performance payments to customers are an important emerging way for utilities to manage peak demand and save money, which means all the ratepayers are saving money, because when the utility is paying less for capacity and transmission services, then all of the utility's customers are paying less. Do you guys want to, is that sufficient as an explanation? Is there anything else that you
was great. We should have started out with you saying that, Todd. That was terrific.
Okay. So with that as a baseline explanation, let's go to the next question. So somebody has commented, it's not really a question, that this webinar reveals an important need to change reimbursements. And I think we kind of went over that sufficiently, but who should be, the question arises, is it just the customers that are enrolled in these programs that should be interested in this because they might, get a higher winter rate for their battery services, or should others who are not battery owners or leasers be interested in this outcome?
Yeah, this is important for everybody that's a utility customer. And I know it sounds a little contradictory, but if we paid more for these incentives, we'd all pay less on our bills. And that's because the incentive programs, the customer programs, are chipping away. They're a little bit taking away from us paying the much more expensive gas peaker plants and other utility scale services. So that's what we're trying not to pay. And we're underpaying on incentives now and getting a little bit away from that. But if we increase the incentives, then we could avoid more of those higher payments, reducing everybody's bills.
Okay, thank you. Somebody is wanting to know, referring to the battery value stack identified in the Massachusetts State of Charge report. And for those that don't know, Massachusetts spent a good amount of money and hired some very well-respected contractors to do a very large and thorough report on the opportunity for battery storage in Massachusetts a few years ago. And that report is still driving much of the policy and program development in the state around storage. So referring to that report, what layers of the cake are we not yet capturing well, given how our various incentive programs motivate battery owners to operate their batteries? In other words, I guess the question is, are there other values, battery services in the value stack that we could be incenting better?
It depends on the program. So there are definitely things that are missed. And so the utilities, through your plan that is for energy efficiency and now for other demand side measures, captures a lot of different benefits. And then the question is kind of, okay, they're capturing it, but do they have the right value for it? Should be higher, but they do have a lot of categories of benefits that they're touching on in there. And when people talk about benefits that are missing from that, some of the benefits are benefits that are specific to low-income households that that's always a question mark if enough of those benefits are being captured, and are they being given the right prices? So that's an area that's talked about. The other one that I would mention for utility programs is with emissions, and the gap that I was talking about before, that measures that reduce annual energy have an emissions benefit, but they're not paying attention to potential emissions reductions and value related to peak shaving. And that's a whole other area that's coming up in a variety of places of how do we measure that? What's the right way to get both the right emissions reduction and the right value on it? But it's not happening right now. If you look at other kinds of programs, like EV charging programs in Massachusetts, some utilities have this and some don't. There are dockets open for adding more programs like this. Those are only valuing energy and summer capacity. They're not valuing other things that even the utility 3-year plans for energy efficiency value, like non-energy benefits. Help me out, Josh. Emissions. What else is missing in there? A thing called drives the price response. That's not being valued in there. There's a couple other things. Transmission and distribution, so needing fewer poles and wires, that's not valued in there. So there's a place that's missing a lot of things. For some of the other programs, including the ISO ones, we don't have as much information about how they're setting up these values. We don't really know what they're including or not including. So yes, there are values missing out there, and some of these programs are putting more effort into trying to capture them than others.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I know, resiliency is often cited as a value that's very difficult to capture and put a dollar amount on for storage. And I should mention that, I said earlier that other states have adopted the connected solutions model. Connecticut has a very good statewide electric storage program that's just been adopted there, and they have higher incentives for low-income and underserved communities to participate, and they also have declared that they're going to try to have a 40% carve out of their program for underserved communities. So, that's an area where we feel that Massachusetts could and should do better. Massachusetts has a commitment, a state commitment to ensuring that underserved communities get to access clean energy and programs and take part in clean energy programs across the board. And yet there is no real provision for that in connected solutions as yet, and that's something we'd like to see corrected. And that's a value, that's a service, again, that's like resilience is maybe difficult to put a dollar figure on, but we think it has value, ensuring that these technologies are not reserved for wealthy early adopters, but are benefiting communities, the communities that need them most. They need them for cost reductions, and they need them for resiliency purposes.
Absolutely, and the AEC paper with CEG, the lead author for that was Brendice Woods, that came out earlier this year, goes over a lot of that information and looks at battery programs in a few different states, and includes in it information about how they're valuing equity and targeting marginalized communities.
Right, and that is, again, available from our website. Okay, we've got a few minutes. We've got 10 minutes. Let's see if we can get through some more questions with some rapid back and forth here. How should the capacity prices paid to supply and demand side resources account for the duration over which they can supply that capacity. Such a consideration would seem especially relevant in preparation for a multi-day cold snap in New England.
Yeah, for sure. And we are taking that into consideration in our calculations to some extent. Part of the answer is that no one resource serves the entire state's needs. Instead, we need a lot of resources, and drawing from a pool of a lot of small resources facilitates that. So you don't need one if people are hooked up to the grid, you don't need one person's battery to last you throughout an entire event. You need to plan on having enough service to last you through the event, and that can be using some batteries first and some second and some third. Whereas if you're counting on a single resource, then that one resource needs to have capacity over the entire period. How would you answer that, Todd? I'm interested.
Yeah, I think that we need to think more in terms of portfolios and aggregations of resources, and less in terms of a single resource compared to another single resource. You know, when I turn on the light switch and the light comes on, I don't really care so much whether the electrons are being generated by sort of a long-term baseload sort of generator, like, say, you know, hydroelectric, or more of a short-term, you know, intermittent generator like wind or solar. As long as there's a sufficient amount of generation on the system, and we're, you know, doing the best we can to go for the low-cost options, and low cost includes, you know, low environmental costs as well as low dollar value at the, you know. So yeah, I think that we've pretty well shown that portfolios of long and short term and dispatchable and intermittent resources are quite good at meeting these kinds of needs. So I think that's maybe an area where, you know, at some point we would love to develop long duration energy storage, and people are working on it. But for the kinds of peaks that we're talking about, I think that we could do an awful lot more than we're doing right now with the storage that we have. Okay, somebody wants to know, should we not continue using gas peakers until we get something that is evidently safe, reliable, and cost-effective for peak loads and grid security? So this goes to the question of, you know, why are the gas peakers being phased out? And is the replacement technology that we're looking at, you know, storage combined with renewables, a safe and effective way to replace them?
Absolutely. It's absolutely that. To be clear, I don't believe that we have enough peak capacity today if we just shut off all those gas peakers. We need to plan for that, and we need to invest in it. And we haven't been doing that, and so we're not ready to shut them off. But yes, these other resources can meet this need. I don't think that that's a question in the literature, at least like in sort of serious technical literature. Rather, the question is it cost effective to do so? And there's a lot of good work being done on that, and on how best to meet our peak need cost effectively. And this resource that we're talking about, customer-based resources, that portfolio, putting together a whole bunch of small resources and paying an incentive for them, it's one of the most cost-effective ways to do it.
Do you want to chime in, Joshua, or are you just adjusting your headset?
Just adjusting my headset. I think Liz kind of hit the nail on the head there.
Sure. Okay. So there's some questions about how the cost figures were arrived at. And so one person wants to know, are you counting the cradle to grave costs for batteries, including recycling costs? And so how do we get to these cost figures? And do we know what's included, or are we sort of taking whatever the industry standard figures are, and do we know what's included in those?
Yeah, of course. So what we looked at in terms of the costs for the peak supply technologies, we used the Lazard report at the time. That was the most recent one. And I believe we mainly just used the levelized cost of energy for each resource. That cost, we took out any energy or capacity payments that these resources could get from other markets, so that we weren't double counting. But aside from the levelized cost of energy, and Liz, you can chime in if needed, I don't think any other costs were included. It would be something to look into, but yeah, I don't think it was in the scope of what we were doing.
Yeah, we're not looking at full life cycle or environmental costs here. Like Josh said, we're beginning with industry standard estimate of what's called the levelized cost of energy for different technologies, and those are the Lazard reports, they're called, and we're looking at the most recent one of those. That is looking at direct market costs. So if it's not something that you're getting charged dollars and cents for in a market, then it's not going to be included there. And so it's going to miss what are called externalities, things that are not market costs, that are impacts on environment and community and so forth. It will miss those things. It's also likely to miss some things that are in a different part of the life cycle, including disposal costs that you're talking about. I would need to look back at the Lazard. I don't know how well it's capturing that. Some of those things are market costs for disposal, and some of them aren't. The true cost of disposal is not the market cost for it. A lot of that is externalities borne by local communities and ecosystems.
Yeah, I would add that if we're talking about lithium-ion batteries, which is the predominant market battery in the market right now for this kind of application, we have not yet seen a recycling market for those batteries really emerge. If you look at, for example, lead-acid batteries, which have been around much longer, there's a very well-developed recycling ecosystem for those batteries. If you take if your car battery is needing to be replaced, then you take it in and get a new car battery. You can trade in your old battery, and that battery gets either refurbished or stripped of its metals and other valuable components, and those are recycled. And there's a whole industry around doing that. Unfortunately, that hasn't really quite developed yet for lithium-ion. And there's so many different lithium-ion chemistries right now that there's just not a dominant one that we can kind of, build a recycling industry around. And there's still a lot of debate about what's the best sort of method, and is it, at what point does it become economic to be a battery recycler for lithium-ion? And that's something that's a serious problem, but I think it'll get solved. But it is right now an issue.
And it's also the case that, sorry, Todd, it's also the case
Sure.
that full life cycle costs are not being included for any other kind of technology too. And that includes anything upstream in terms of both fuels and technology and materials. And for natural gas, that includes all of the upstream leaks from the transmission and distribution system, from extraction and refining. those fuels, which are considerable.
Sure. I think we run out of time. I do appreciate everybody sending in these questions, and I apologize that we haven't gotten to all of them, but hopefully we've got to a good number of them. And I want to thank our presenters. Encourage all of the listeners, if you want to learn more, go to our website, download the report, take a look. I hope that we'll be able to continue to do more work in this area because I think it's something that's needed. And I will hand this back over to Samantha for a few final words before we close.
Thanks, Todd, and thank you very much to Joshua and Liz for your great presentations and answering so many questions. Normally now I would tell people about upcoming webinars, but we don't have any on the books yet, but I'm sure that we will. So I hope to see all of you in 2022 at some more of our webinars. And for now, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, everyone, and we'll see you next year. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.